I was collaborating with the most conceited person I had ever encountered. I no longer appear in the series. The Chips Brotherhood was a fantasy. Erik, had you fired? They asked. What do you mean? How? How did he do that? I asked. Behind the helmets, the conflict was cold. For many years, people thought that Erik Estrada and Larry Wilcox had the same relationship off-screen that they did on TV. Wilcox, however, eventually speaks up at the age of 78. Also, the reality differs from what viewers had anticipated. Why did he have to wait so long? Was the turning point a near-fatal motorcycle accident? Today, we expose the egos, legal actions, and startling actions that drove him away, as well as the forgiveness that ultimately put an end to their conflict. Performance or chemistry? Frank "Ponch" Ponarello and John Baker were the quintessential California couple on television. Easygoing, endearing, and incredibly likable. Every week, Chips fans watched as Larry Wilcox and Erik Estrada joked their way through rescues, fast-paced pursuits, and sunny escapades. Viewers felt the chemistry must be genuine because it seemed so natural. Now, however, Wilcox reveals something that few could have predicted. Instead of a portrayal of genuine relationship, viewers witnessed the strength of professionalism. A developing tension off camera was frequently concealed by the grins on camera. Wilcox felt a conflict from the start. He says his initial reaction to Estrada was nearly overwhelming. Swagger, attention-seeking, repeated priming, and mirrors. The young celebrity, constantly aware of his appearance, hair, and makeup, strolled in and out of the set. Wilcox remembers that Estrada added to the air of unbridled ego by constantly making advances on women and occasionally inviting them to his trailer. Wilcox found it shocking. He acknowledges that he believed he was working with the most conceited man he had ever encountered. It was a culture shock for a Marine veteran, accustomed to discipline and modesty. Wilcox, however, was well aware of the guidelines for surviving in Hollywood. He wasn't the focus of the series, he told himself. It was about the group, the team, and the audience, who anticipated easy friendship. Consequently, he decided, be patient. Personal annoyances would not stop him from doing his job. To keep himself from moping in resentment, he developed a code for himself. Perhaps he is to blame. Perhaps, he thought, it was mine. In any case, avoid getting lost in it. He was able to film for 5 seasons because to such mentality, few fans ever witnessed something like this endurance. How much of the chemistry in Hollywood is fake? Despite scarcely tolerating one another behind the scenes, the two men were able to convey charm and rhythm on screen. Skilled actors are known for their ability to make fiction seem real. Wilcox now acknowledges that their well-known relationship was actually a truce masquerading as friendship for extended periods of time. Audiences never suspected a rift since it was so convincingly portrayed for the camera. While the actors gritted their teeth and completed the task, viewers projected their own dreams onto the pair. Here, 3 things are noteworthy. First, even when there is a lot of tension off screen, chemistry can still be developed on screen. Another professional skill is endurance. The series remained credible because of Wilcox's capacity to separate the personal from the professional. Third, the lens affects perception. Warmth was seen by fans. Wilcox saw poisoning. Neither was entirely incorrect. It just relied on your position. Wilcox's memories highlight the unspoken price of maintaining appearances. He was required to set aside his displeasure and exhibit the kind of playful camaraderie that made Chips a cultural icon week after week. But behind the scenes, he was burdened with annoyance and bitterness. He bottled it up since he couldn't confront Estrada without running the danger of explosions on set or in the media. The show had years of popularity as a result of that decision. However, it also created pressure that would eventually surface. However, nothing could sustain the facade indefinitely. One stunt gone wrong. Estrada almost lost his life in a crash that permanently altered the power dynamics on set. An uncomfortable truce quickly turned into something far more perilous, for Wilcox's future as well as for Estrada's body. Blood, lawsuits, and leverage were used to rewrite the relationship after it was tested the day a motorcycle flipped through the air. Math was altered by the crash. The sound of engines roaring and the painful twist of a stunt gone wrong marked a turning moment. What ought to have been just another typical Chips action scenario descended into chaos. The motorcycle owned by Erik Estrada went into a hazardous high side, of the most dreaded kinds of collisions. He was thrown into a truck after the bike overturned and crashed into him. The set abruptly changed from a Hollywood production to a real-life emergency. As paramedics rushed and crew members panicked, Larry Wilcox, who had served in the Marine Corps, leaped in to provide first aid. The wounds were severe. Doctors feared a torn aorta. Estrada's lungs were full with blood, and his sternum was shattered. At the hospital, he was granted last rites. He might not make it through the night, so everyone prepared for the worst. Despite their tense relationship, Wilcox had worked side by side with him, and now found himself in the bizarre situation of saving the man he had endured so much. He helped keep him alive and stabilized him so that he could be taken. Ego wars didn't matter in that time. It was a matter of survival. However, there are repercussions for survival, particularly in Hollywood. Despite a drawn-out and agonizing recuperation, Estrada did survive. However, survival also meant leverage. Later, another motorbike accident, real or contrived. Wilcox offered Estrada a legal opening by acknowledging that he was never certain. The studio found itself in a tight spot after he filed a lawsuit against MGM and NBC, demanding damages. Producers and networks have to deal with more than simply an actor. They were up against a celebrity who had both power and sympathy on his side. This is where television's icy math enters the picture. For the majority of viewers, Chips was about humor, adventure, and friendship. It was about syndication for the network. 6 seasons were required for a show to be eligible for the lucrative reruns. It was a wonderful run after 5 seasons. 6 suggested that profits would be coming in for years, or even decades. There was no negotiating that 6th season. Should NBC and MGM fail to deliver, the investment would fail. They were therefore left with little option when Estrada imposed his lawsuit on them and demanded concessions. In addition to his persona, he had become essential to the project's overall financial viability. In the midst of that conundrum was Wilcox. He found out how popular he was overseas in when he went to Brazil on a commercial tour. Paulo. At the airport, he was met by 40,000 admirers, many of whom were wearing mini-chip uniforms. He was boosted by the admiration of a crowd that demonstrated his worldwide appeal, and for an hour he felt like Elvis. Wilcox would have been unbeatable if the show had been about popularity contests. However, in boardrooms in Los Angeles, leverage was more important than popularity. The news hit him like a sucker punch when he got back. The call was delivered via his agent. "You're being let go by NBC." Estrada's demands, one of which was that Wilcox be removed, were the cause. The network felt stuck even if they detested the choice. There wouldn't have been a 6th season, syndication, or return on investment without Estrada. There was hope with him, but only if Wilcox was given up. It was catastrophic in human terms. They alter power, contracts, and careers. Second, when corporate math takes over, fan loyalty is insufficient to keep you safe. Third, the logic of leverage can negate even actions that save lives. 5 years after Wilcox practically saved Estrada's life, he was let go at his request. It was cruelly ironic. This was more than just a dismissal for Wilcox. A warning that friendships and even bravery may be overshadowed by spreadsheet statistics. In the entertainment industry, it was a betrayal disguised in business jargon. For him personally, it also signaled the start of a new downward spiral. After 5 years of stress, he found that his fortitude had not guaranteed his position. It had prepared him for expulsion. Although there was bloodshed, panic, and frantic medical attention during the disaster, the following was solely a matter of economics. Studios made a brutal choice when comparing Wilcox to syndication. He was the price of the sacrifice that the math required. Even though it was outrageous, Wilcox wouldn't go quietly. He wrote his own exit headline before anybody else could, instead launching a daring counterplay. Dismissed. He therefore penned the headline. Even though Larry Wilcox had experienced many pranks, nothing had prepared him for the blow that greeted him upon his return from Brazil. He had just returned from a trip in which 40,000 people gathered around him, like a rock star at the airport. His every action was monitored by the Brazilian press. Wilcox briefly felt untouchable, as children wore Chips outfits. But things were ruthlessly different back home. The news that slammed him like a ton of bricks was delivered by his agent over the phone. "NBC is letting you go." Wilcox was out after keeping the show together for years after saving Estrada's life on the asphalt. Even worse, Estrada had made the demand himself. The majority of actors would have become silent or indignant. Wilcox, however, had a different side. He had a business-like way of thinking. He was aware that the story was as crucial in Hollywood as the deal. He would be labeled as damaged goods if news spread that he had been fired, and no studio wanted to deal with that liability. He took action first, rather than waiting for the news to go out. He summoned his lawyer, Martin Leeds, his team, Rogers and Cowan, a reputable journalist from the Los Angeles Times, and his well-known public relations firm. It was a straightforward but bold plan. The world would assume it was his decision if NBC wanted him gone. The encounter took place at one of Wilcox's favorite places in the valley, a popular French bistro. He outlined the story during lunch. He wasn't a wasted celebrity. He was a guy making his own decisions as he proceeded to new horizons. The author's quotes were incisive enough to break through the clutter. Lines that demonstrated Wilcox's lack of wound-licking behavior. He was entering the second act. The headline accurately conveyed the story when the article was published. Larry Wilcox has made the decision to depart from Chips. It appeared to the public that he had left with assurance. The facade of self-determination concealed the pain of being ejected. This move demonstrates how important image control is in the film industry. Wilcox recognized three realities. First, there is no dignity. It's well made. An article in the right spot can shield a person's reputation for years. Second, PR isn't nonsense. It is a matter of survival. Managing your story is crucial in a field that depends heavily on perception. Third, you retain control if you don't accept victimization. Yes, he had been caught off guard, but he didn't want to appear weak. Rather, he presented himself as the decision-maker. However, the rage persisted behind the scenes. He acknowledges that his small-town punk side, which believed in settling scores under the barn, desired retribution. He had fantasies about physically facing Estrada and letting out all of his pent-up rage. However, he was aware that route would demolish him more quickly than any studio could. It would have been wiser to direct the energy into something positive. Wilcox hurried. Wilcox was already working on his next act. As Estrada continued with Chips, he demonstrated that he was more than just an actor by producing Ray Bradbury Theater for 5 years, all over the world. He purchased the rights to Dorothy Stratton's terrible narrative, Death of a Playmate, and turned it into a well-known project. While others slept, he was proposing shows, developing screenplays, and making deals. He changed from being an employee to an entrepreneur. He wasn't only getting by, he was changing who he was. Nevertheless, the wound persisted even as he forged new routes. For years he thought the public accepted his version of the narrative he had decided to leave. However, the confirmation that followed rekindled the old flame. It was like peeling out the scab when a producer named Cy Chirac sat across from him one day and said, "Larry, I was in the room when Estrada had you fired." Abandonment and betrayal struck again. It was fact, not merely a hearsay. This section of Wilcox's narrative emphasizes a challenging lesson. In Hollywood, appearances are just as important as skill. Even though you may be well-liked in Brazil, respected by critics, and appreciated by fans, you are disposable if the studio math demands it. The tale you leave behind is the only thing you can control. And that is just what Wilcox accomplished. Even though he was ejected, he left on his own terms in the eyes of the public and the media. Controlling the story, however, did not make the resentment go away. Wilcox held the resentment like a burden for 5 long years, until he made an unexpected choice that turned his feud into forgiveness. 5 years of rage. Through interviews, Larry Wilcox was able to smile, manipulate the press, and revive his career. Another truth, however, simmered beneath the cameras when they were turned off. He was upset. No essay could adequately describe the depth of the betrayal's sting. He and Estrada had not just argued on set. A producer confirmed that he had actively lobbied for Wilcox's dismissal. Wilcox had saved Estrada's life following a collision. But after years of putting up with the swagger, the ego, and the posturing, he was cast away. It takes time for that type of wound to heal. For 5 years, Wilcox carried that burden. He acknowledges that there were evenings when his inner hick desired nothing more than to resolve disputes man to man, behind the barn. He dreamed of demonstrating to Estrada what it meant to be disloyal to someone who took great satisfaction in discipline and fidelity. Even in those instances, though, he was restrained by another voice, the sensible businessman who realized that route would only lead to disaster. Anger doesn't create a future, but it may keep you going for a night. Knowing that didn't make it go away, though. Anger actually became a habit. According to Wilcox, it nourished itself. One nighttime drink became another. The topic of the treachery came up again. Anger became a constant companion, a silent reminder of unfairness. He might put it away by working on film projects, pursuing new business, or presenting Ray Bradbury Theater. However, the resentment returned when the phones ceased to ring and the rooms became silent. The heart was trapped, but the career was progressing. From this stage of his life, 3 things can be learned. To begin with, resentment is alluring. In the moment, it gives you strength, but over time, it wears you down. Second, healing is not the same as endurance. After being betrayed, his 5 years of perseverance on the set with Estrada only served to exacerbate the hurt. Third, even when the other person has moved on, anger is like locking yourself in a jail. When Wilcox posed a harsh question to himself, it was the pivotal moment. Will you always wriggle in your retaliation? He became aware that he was not being satisfied by his fury. It wasn't making his life more fulfilling or improving his quality of sleep. Rather, it was binding him to an unchangeable history. The boardroom agreement that had terminated his tenure on Chips could not be rewritten with any degree of resentment. Finding a way out or remaining in the cage was the only option left. Thus, he took a decision that few would have predicted. He would fall in love with this guy rather than escalating the conflict. He wouldn't manipulate or pretend. It has to be authentic. If Estrada want attention at events, Wilcox would take a back seat. Wilcox would gladly refer admirers to Ponch if they wanted photos with him. Wilcox would comply and encourage Estrada to overshadow him in interviews. He consciously eschewed competition in favor of humility. It appeared to be capitulation to some. It was freedom for Wilcox. The outcomes were unexpected. He felt lighter the more he embraced this way of thinking. It no longer hurt to help Estrada. In fact, it released him from the clutches of bitterness. At conventions, he discovered that he was laughing once more, and relishing the enthusiasm of fans without the previous resentment. He regained emotional control by deciding to disarm the feud. He was no longer owned by the feud. He had forgotten about it. To forgive was not to forget. The treachery was still fresh in his mind. He could still feel the agony of being evicted. However, those recollections were no longer poisonous. They weren't the definition of his story. They were a part of it. Furthermore, Wilcox discovered something superior than vindication by removing the influence of resentment. Calm. Peace, however, only arrived once Wilcox changed his viewpoint and began to see Erik as the man who had been molded by a more brutal history, rather than as the enemy who had betrayed him. Not Estrada, but Erik. Sometimes you have to look past what someone did and try to understand why in order to forgive them. That change for Larry Wilcox occurred when he began dating Erik, the man from Harlem. Instead of Erik Estrada, the Peacock star, Wilcox started looking at his former co-star from a new perspective, one influenced by survival, adversity, and upbringing. Estrada hadn't had the luxury of easy loyalty, stability, or trust as a child. He was raised in a challenging neighborhood, in a dysfunctional home, and in an era when ambition was more than simply pride. It was a matter of survival. From that vantage point, Estrada's actions appeared different. The continual attention-seeking, the strutting, the mirror checks. What Wilcox used to perceive as haughtiness now appeared more like armor. Appearances were a guarantee of safety in Hollywood. Estrada saw every joke, brag, and smile as a means of fortifying himself against a society that had taught him to have no faith in anyone. Estrada's energy wasn't always about ego, Wilcox recognized. Protecting his position in a competitive sector and demonstrating his belongingness to both himself and others were the main goals. Empathy was made possible by this reinterpretation. First, everyone's acts make sense in the context of the storm that shaped them. Speaking to point 2, personal dread is frequently concealed by professional competitiveness. Speaking to point 3, compassion explains betrayal but does not justify it. Wilcox told himself that Estrada wasn't making personal jabs at him. As the series star, he was battling for his own survival, and Wilcox had turned into a barrier in that battle. You don't deserve sympathy for hurdles when you're trying to reach the summit. They are pushed aside. Wilcox's burden changed as he came to terms with that. He stopped seeing Estrada's actions to be personal jabs. He viewed them as survival strategies, from a man who had a different starting line instead. That insight lessened the pain of the past, but it did not remove it. He even regained his appreciation for Estrada as a performer, rather than as an adversary. According to Wilcox, he is an entertainer who enjoys entertaining. Estrada's extravagant actions were no longer bothersome from that perspective. They were simply a component of his identity. This shift manifested itself in real-world ways. Wilcox tended to be generous when he appeared in public and at fan events. Wilcox accepted the attention that was directed upon Estrada, rather than resisting it. Wilcox directed followers toward Punch, if they wanted it in their pictures. Wilcox allowed Estrada to shine if reporters concentrated on his personality. He found that he was not diminished by giving Estrada the stage. It freed him. Wilcox found peace in letting go of the competition. The fact that this wasn't a phony act of forgiveness is amazing. It wasn't manipulation to seem good in the media or win back fans. It was authentic. Wilcox had come to the conclusion that resentment was no longer worthwhile. And after he made that decision, his actions were a logical progression. Estrada didn't have to apologize to him anymore. He was no longer in need of approval. By refusing to let past traumas to define him, he had already regained control. And now for the surprising turn. Wilcox ultimately benefited more from forgiveness than Estrada did. The resentment had kept him bound to the past, like a burden on his chest. His life became lighter after he let it go. The pain of betrayal would no longer cloud his thoughts as he looked back at chips, laughed at old stories, and enjoyed fan activities. He could now look back on the same collaboration that had once made him angry with appreciation for the lessons it had taught him. Wilcox had changed, but not Estrada. And that shift made it possible for him to proceed in peace and dignity. He changed from being the actor who carried a feud for decades to finally letting it go. What prompted Larry Wilcox to finally share his side of the tale at the age of 78, after decades of silence? What's he talking about at 78? Larry Wilcox remained silent for decades. Although rumors circulated, journalists made insinuations, and fans conjectured, he never took the time to speak candidly about his years on Chips. He encouraged viewers to cling to the idea of an unbreakable friendship by letting the reruns play and letting the nostalgia flow. However, Wilcox has decided to speak now at the age of 78. Why now? Time, perspective, and the freedom that comes from not having to preserve an image are the answers. As you enter later stages of life, your perspective on the world changes. Wilcox claims that becoming older gave him a certain insight that he was unable to have in a crisis. Emotions were raw in those days. Angry feelings impaired judgment. Honesty was risky because of pride. But now that decades have passed, he can finally distinguish between what was important and what wasn't. He no longer needs retribution, and he no longer needs to vie with Estrada for attention. His legacy is already written at the age of 78. It's not about settling scores when we speak. It has to do with keeping records. Wilcox picked this particular moment for 3 main reasons. Timing as mercy comes first. He might use his words as teaching tools rather than weapons if he waited until the drama subsided. The feud would have escalated into a tabloid battle if he had spoken up in the 1980s. He makes sure the story is viewed with contemplation rather than indignation by being silent at the time and speaking now. Secondly, fans need clarity. People thought the smiles represented friendship for years. Wilcox wants the audience to know the reality, not to ruin their passion for the act, but to show them respect by revealing the truth. Third, advice for aspiring actors. He is aware that the same difficulties, ego conflicts, studio politics, and contract disputes would be faced by future generations. His narrative serves as a guide for getting through it, without allowing resentment to define you. It's easier for another reason. Calm. Being silent can weigh as much as being angry. The story remained in Wilcox's mind even after he learned to forgive. He lets go of the last burden by telling it now. The goal is not to disparage Estrada. He makes a special effort to recognize Estrada's skill, charm, and passion for performing. It's about honestly ending his own chapter. Demystifying the industry is another goal of his. Hollywood frequently appears glitzy and carefree to viewers. Wilcox, however, is wiser. He experienced the politics of syndication math, where millions of dollars may be decided by a single season. He lived with the harsh reality that who stays and who leaves is determined by contracts rather than friendship. He reveals that truth by sharing his narrative, not to ruin the nostalgia, but to give viewers a better understanding of what's actually happening behind the glossy ads. Wilcox's tone is arguably the most striking. He no longer exudes resentment. He doesn't disrespect people. Rather, his tone is one of serene acceptance. He can acknowledge that Estrada harmed him, but he can also acknowledge that his own difficult history influenced Estrada's need for fame. Only time can provide that balance, the capacity to contain truth without venom. Wilcox has it, and it's evident at 78. Why now then? Sincerity no longer jeopardizes his prospects at this point. It keeps his legacy intact. Additionally, Wilcox wants to share the lesson he learned the hard way with his fans, friends, and aspiring actors. After years of keeping the incident under wraps, that pride is less important than peace. And the last thing Wilcox wants the world to remember is that lesson, one that was costly, difficult to learn, and liberating. He wants everyone to remember the lesson. Larry Wilcox wants his story to conclude with more than just another Hollywood feud. After all the stunts, accidents, betrayals, and years of silence, he doesn't want to be known as the actor who left Chips at its heyday, or as the guy who got into a fight with Erik Estrada. He wants people to learn the larger lesson that how you choose to react defines your legacy, not what other people did to you. He described Estrada as a teacher and a rival. Wilcox acknowledges that he might not have learned about his own forbearance, commercial acumen, or resilience if it weren't for those confrontations. Despite the pain, the struggle made him mature. That's his lessons initial section. You are sometimes most shaped by the individuals that irritate you the most. In an odd way, he once saved Estrada's life on the asphalt. He was also given a new kind of existence by Estrada, one that required fortitude, perspective, and development. The lesson's second section focuses on letting go. Wilcox wore his rage like a medal for years. It strengthened him, he believed. It bound him to the past instead. He didn't find true strength until he chose to forgive, not because Estrada expressed regret, but because Wilcox himself desired freedom. He asked himself, "Are you going to wallow in vengeance forever?" He knew the answer had to be no. It wasn't losing to let go. Regaining his peace was the goal. The lesson's third section discusses legacy in general. Wilcox, who is 78 years old, is content with the fact that he will always be remembered by fans as John Baker, the dependable, well-groomed police officer in a tan uniform who rode with punch. However, he also wants them to keep in mind the person who wears the badge. A hustler, a producer, a Marine, and most importantly, a person who discovered that kindness is more powerful than resentment. He believes that decision is more important than any battle for viewers or syndication agreement. What happened on Chips is just one example of a universal truth, Wilcox says. You will encounter unfair decisions, ego conflicts, and treachery in any relationship or career. That is beyond your control. Whether or not you allow it to engulf you is within your control. You wind yourself in a jail of your own devising if you harbor all your grievances. However, you find a freedom that no one can take away if you learn to let it go. He provides that pattern to anyone who is mired in hatred, not just performers. How do you feel with Larry Wilcox's choice to finally speak up? Has it altered your perception of Chips and the alliance that shaped it? Please leave your ideas in the comments section below. We'd love to hear them. Please remember to use the like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell if you like this in-depth look at a timeless TV reality. This way, you won't miss another story. And click the video on your screen right now if you're prepared for additional behind-the-scenes disclosures. We have yet another Hollywood secret in store for you.